Hi, everyone. I want to talk about Module 8 for a minute and about students with exceptionalities. Um, I think, again, great discussion, fantastic ideas. I just wanted to highlight a couple of ideas and kind of put my own spin on things. The first thing that I want to highlight is I think it was a comment that I read by Kristen, and then a lot of others echoed the comment. And it was about the fact that we're talking about um, accommodating students with or without IEPs. So I think that that's really important to understand as a teacher is that not all of your students with exceptionalities are going to have IEPs, and that if you think of a teaching strategy that's good for your students with exceptionalities, you really should consider the fact that they it might be a strategy that's good for all of your students. So, for example, in math, for a long time, using manipulatives used to be a accommodation for students with exceptionalities, and now we understand that all students benefit from learning with manipulatives. And I mean, this is a movement like 20, 30 years ago, but you see how something that used to be just good for some is now considered to be good for all. Um, Jesse brought up the idea of self advocacy and that being a strategy that's directly taught to students with exceptionalities. This is an immensely important skill. When you consider the fact that our students with exceptionalities are going to be going to college or university or the workplace or anything, they have to be able to self advocate. In university, they have great services and great accommodations and things like that for students that are willing to self advocate. So nobody's going to seek out a student applicant past university because they come in with an IEP from high school. But if that student goes into the office for students with exceptionalities and self advocates, they can get great additional resources to help them out. Okay. Um, and I myself, one of my best friends who I lived with for 4 years in university, he is a student with exceptionalities, and he took advantage of this stuff and said that there's no way that he could get through university without that. And now he's a tenured professor at U of T. I mean, people need supports to learn in different ways, right? Um, Amanda brought up the idea of flexible group learning, and that is enormous because some people also wrote in their modifications, in their accommodations, that some students do prefer to work on their own and work quietly. And so that's why flexible group learning is so important, because when we say everybody get into groups of three, that's tough for students to do because somebody's going to be left out, somebody's going to be wanting a group of four, things like that. But if we say groups of two or three, now students have an option. If there's a group of four, they can just split into two twos. It's not a big deal. And students should always have the opportunity to work on their own as well. But we do need to guide them to practice those collaborative skills, because that's a 21st century skill that we do need to foster. Shu's experience and her comment about math is easier to understand in context. That is huge. I'm glad that a lot of you echoed the sentiment that just having symbols down doesn't necessarily simplify the math, but having it in context so that students can understand, oh, this is a familiar context, so I am going to use multiplication, things like that. And Kathy Marks Kirpan has a book called Math Expressions, and it's a wonderful book that talks about just this: is that in context, students can learn the conceptual understanding of math versus when we just try to pick out keywords that actually, while we think that it's helping students, that's hindering our students, because keywords in math don't work all the time. There is no hard and fast rule. For example, the word of, a lot of people associate that with multiplication always, right? But a student's going to come across a problem where there's the word of and it's not necessarily multiplication. So we have to make sure that students understand the math in context versus just pulling out those keywords that we want them to focus on, right? And to add on to that, Vimala's AT saying less is more. And this takes me right back to open questions. And when we talk about the fact that when we say less, students have to fill in the blanks, and that's okay because they can fill in those blanks in their native language or in a context that they appreciate, things like that. So, for example, I'm going to bring it right back to the second question about the. I'm going to bring it right back to the second question about the perimeter and the fence. So when the question is, there's a rectangular field and it's fenced in by 70.8 meters of fence and it's 20.4 meters long. Determine the width of the field. Right. So when a student reads that, they read all the information and they're trying to code it, but then they determine the width of the field, and that takes over their brain space. And then they have to go back and they have to fill in all the blanks about the questions. Right. So just one way to change the question, and again, this is for all students, but especially your ELL students. Think of phrasing the question as, determine the width of a field. It's a rectangle. It's 20.4 meters long, and it's fenced in by 70.8 meters of fence. So when we give all the information and then ask the question, we think that that's what students need, but that's actually counterintuitive, because if we ask the question first, the student's brain goes to, well, what shape is the field? Oh, it's a rectangular field. How long is the field? Oh, it's this long. What other information do I have? Oh, it's perimeters, blah, blah, blah. So right when we ask, determine the width of a field, students they develop a cognitive gap that needs to be filled in by certain pieces of information, right? Versus if we start filling in the pieces, they don't know what the question is yet, so they don't know how to code that information. So always think about reversing the question. So a word problem, pose the question first, and then fill in the information that the students might want. All right. Thank you very much, and we'll talk again, Module 9.